In this lesson, we're going to be going over how to use a static crosshair. And we're also going to be going over how to hide our cursor and how we can hide it and lock it to the center of our screen. This will allow us to use the crosshair as our sole visual reference for where we're going to be shooting. We're also going to be going over how to modify our shoot script so that when we're looking down the iron sights, we're no longer displaying the crosshair, and then when we let go and we're back in our idle state, we're going to see the crosshair reappear. We're also going to be going over how to change the color of our crosshair when we're aiming at enemy characters. So let's get started. Let's take a look at the project files first. So I'm going to be in the lesson to start of the project files. This scene already has everything that we need. If we take a look at the UI folder, you will notice that we have our crosshair in here. So this is the crosshair we're going to be using. You can see what it looks like over here. So it's a 50 by 50 image. It has some transparency with just the crosshair being visible. And this is set up as a texture type of sprite 2D and UI. So before we take a look at the scripting, let's first add in our UI elements. So we're going to do this by going up to Game Object, UI, and then Image. If you scroll out here, you can actually see what the image looks like by default. Now by default, the canvas is going to be set to screen space overlay. If you take a look in the hierarchy, you're going to see the canvas, an image, and the event system. So the canvas by default is going to be set to screen space overlay, meaning it's going to be displayed over the entirety of our screen. Let's take a look at the image. Now sometimes the image appears directly in the center. Right now it's kind of off center, so we need to move it back to the center. If we scroll in here, you may be able to see the anchor point. So there is the anchor point. And the anchor point is important because that anchor point is going to determine where that image is if the size of the screen does change. Now in our case, we want this image to be directly in the center point because that's where we're going to be aiming. So to move the image, you can either manually move this into place, or you can also use some of the tools in the rect transform section up here. So with the image selected, I have the image selected in here in the hierarchy. Go up to the rect transform section, click on this icon. This will open up the anchor presets. Now in here, we can manually move our image by selecting one of these presets in here. So if you hold on Alt on your keyboard, you can set the position. So hold down Alt, you can see that the icons change, and click on the center point right here. Yeah, so move the image for you. The anchor point is going to stay in the center. We will be covering anchor points in subsequent lessons. But for now, I think this is good right here. I'm going to close that up. So now we have our image directly in the center. This is going to be used as our crosshair. So let's add in our crosshair image. So select the crosshair image from the UI folder. Drag it into the source image slot. Note that the image right now is 100 by 100. The actual image that we are using is 50 by 50. There we go. So resize the width and the height, not the scale. The width and height refers to the pixel values. If you switch back to the game view, you can see how big the crosshair is. Now in this case, that may be a little bit too big. You could resize this to your liking. In my case, I'm going to switch this back down to 25 to 25, and I think that's pretty good for the most part. It does look visible. It is a little bit smaller, but overall, I think I like this size. All right, let's give this a quick test and see how this looks. So if we hit play, we should see that the crosshair follows around now. Now remember, this UI element is applied across our screen. So wherever we move, this is always going to be displayed on our screen. So it actually looks like the crosshair is following our camera. Now you will notice that our crosshair and our cursor are still visible in the same view here. So we want to be able to hide this cursor and lock it to the center of the screen. Now that's something we'll be covering in a moment, but one other thing that I want to go over is the iron sights. So if I look down the iron sights by holding down the right click on my mouse, first off, you will notice that the gun is slightly off. The crosshair is right about here, but the iron sights are right about here. Now in this case, I'm not going to move the weapon. I'm just going to hide the crosshair. The accuracy is slightly off, but I think that's perfectly fine in our case. I do want the crosshair to disappear when I'm looking down the iron sights, and then when I let go, I want it to reappear. So we're going to be modifying our shoot script first. So before we take a look at the shoot script, let's go and rename some of our elements in here. So the canvas, we're just going to rename to UI, and the image, we'll just rename to crosshair. So we know exactly what they are. All right, let's go into our shoot script. So that's going to be applied on our rig. Open up the moving rig, open up the rig handgun, or select it rather, and you should see the shoot script. Just double click on it. All right, let's scroll up to the very top. So within this script, you're going to see one commented out variable at the very bottom of our list here. It is a public game object crosshair. So we're going to be enabling and disabling this game object, which is our crosshair. Let's scroll down until we see the iron sights function, which is right here. Let's uncomment out these lines right here and here. So what we're doing here is when we're holding down the fire 2 key, which is the right click on our mouse, we're going to be disabling our crosshair. So crosshair.setActive false. And this is going to be true for any game object. So game objects are going to be having set active. So you can either set it to false or true. SetActive.false means it's going to be disabled. Then setActive.true is going to re-enable it. So we're no longer in that zoomed in state. All right, and that's what we're going to do in the shoot script. Go ahead and save that. And let's give this another test. We need to add in our crosshair this time. You can see it popped up. Just go into the UI, drag in the crosshair into that game object slot. There we go. We have our crosshair. Let's hit play. And now when I zoom in, you can see it disappears. Let go, it comes back up. All right, great. Now we're going to be creating a UI script, which is going to control all the elements as far as UI goes. But in this first part, we're going to be going over how to change the color of our crosshair when we're looking at an enemy character. So there is a UI script ready to go in the scripts folder. Just double click to open it up. All right, so at the very top of the script, you'll notice that we have this using Unity Engine.ui. If you are using UI elements within your script, you need to have this in there. So this is the namespace so that we can access all the UI elements. It's called the UI. We have a public game object cam. Now, once again, we're going to be using some raycasting for this, and we're going to be using the camera as our origin point for that raycast. So it's going to be the same exact position as the raycast that we have when we're shooting our weapon. So we have public game object cam, and then we have public float range, which is the same range as our weapon. So both of these are going to be very similar to what we had in the shoot script. If you're coming from the weapon mechanics course, they should seem very similar. Next, we have a public image crosshair. So we're going to be changing the color of our crosshair, and to do that, we're going to be using the image type. If you don't have this namespace up there, this is actually going to show up red. So if you add this in, if we just comment this out, you'll see what I mean. So you can see it turns red, and usually if it's red, it's because it's missing or there's something wrong with it. Right, there we go. And then finally, we have our private float fade time equals 1f, and this is mostly going to be used for a color.lerp section that we're going to be covering in a moment. We have the void awake. Now here is where we're going to be disabling the visibility of our cursor and locking it to the center of our screen. So we have, first off, locking it to the center of our screen. So cursor.lockState equals cursor.lockMode.locked. That's going to lock it to the center of our screen. Then we want to disable it from being visible, so cursor.visible equals false. Next, in our update function, we have one function that we're going to be constantly checking to see if it's been updated. That function is down here. So void color changing. We have all of our raycasting information. If you've been through the weapon mechanics course, this is pretty much exactly the same as before. We have the vector3 value up here called FWD for forward. So we're setting the position of the raycast based off the position of the camera, which is going to be the forward position of that camera. We have a raycast hit. So we want to have a variable for our hitting of the raycast. Next, underneath that, we have a debug.drawRay. This is purely for debugging. This is not going to show up in your game. This will show up in the scene view though. This will allow us to draw out a ray. So we have cam.transform.position, the origin point. We have the direction that we want to go in, which is forward times the range that we set. And then we have the color of the ray. So it's going to be color.green. So this is going to display our raycast in a green color in the scene view. Next, we're checking to see if we're hitting something. So physics.raycast cam.transform.position. So once again, this is very similar to what we have in the debug.drawRay. Cam.transform.position, the direction. We want to make sure that we hit something, and then we want to set the range of that raycast, which is the range variable. All right, so if we are hit something, we then want to check to see if what we hit has a enemy tag. So if hit.collider.compare tag enemy, note that we're looking at a collider. So we need to check to see if we're hitting a collider with a tag of enemy. If so, then we're going to be setting the color of our crosshair to change from white to red. So color.lerp, lerp being linear interpolation. So we're going from one point to another, which in this case is going to be a color. So we're going from the white color here to the color of red, and we're basing it off a fade time, which is a float value. Now note that with color.lerp in this case, it is going to be nearly instantaneous. So we're going to go from white to red nearly instantly. That's perfectly fine for our case. So here we're checking to see if we're not hitting something with a tag of enemy. So if we're hitting a collider that doesn't have a tag of enemy, then we want to make sure that it goes from red to white. So if we're looking at an enemy character and it turns red, and then we look away, maybe we're looking at a wall or something like that, we're going to go from red back to white. So it's the exact same thing, except it's going in the opposite direction in regards to the colors. Now underneath that, we have an else statement, and we'll be going over this a bit more a little bit later on. But here we're checking to see if we're hitting something, and here we're checking to see if we're not hitting something. So in this case, if we're looking up in the air, we want to make sure that that crosshair is going to be set to white. And this is something we'll be covering a bit more a little bit later on. Let's go and save this now. Minimize this. And we're going to be applying this to our UI, which is the canvas itself. Just drag the UI script over into the inspector panel. All right, so we need to assign a camera right here for our game object that says cam. Drag in the first person character into that slot. The first person character is the camera of our FPS controller. The range is set to 1000, and then we have the crosshair, which is going to be our UI image. Drag in the crosshair into that slot. There we go. Now we need to add in our tags for our enemy characters. Let's switch back to the scene view real quick. Let me go ahead and zoom in here. So I'm going to press the moving rig. I'm going to press F to zoom in on the moving rig. There we go. Now the enemy characters are these dummies that you see throughout this scene. So to do this, we're going to be applying a tag to the objects that have a collider. So the way the script is going to work is, first off, it's going to detect a collider. Then it's going to detect if that collider has a tag. So if you apply a tag to a mesh that doesn't have a collider, then it's not going to detect that at all. So what we're going to be doing is, if we open up the dummy section here, dummy is the parent object that holds all the dummies in here. So I'm going to select this guy right here, just left click on him. There we go. So this is just the mesh itself. If you take a look in here, we have an enemy collider, then the body itself is a child object of the enemy collider. So this is the actual collider itself on the enemy character. We have one on the mesh as well, which is the drum. So if you click on the drum, this also has a mesh collider. So we want to apply tags to both of these in here. Now we're not going to be applying tags to each one of these individually. We can actually do this from the prefab section itself. So go into the prefabs folder. You'll find the enemy dummy, and I've already made a prefab of this character with the colliders already applied. So we're going to be applying an enemy tag to the enemy collider and the drum. So make sure that you apply both of them because they are separate and they will have separate colliders. So with the enemy collider selected, if you go to the very top in the inspector panel, you're going to see tag right here. By default, it is going to be untagged. We need to add in an enemy tag. To add in enemy tag, click on add tag down here. The section that says tags, it's going to say list is empty. Click on the plus icon. You can add in a new tag. And in our script, we used enemy with a lowercase e. All right, now we need to go back into the prefab. Click on enemy collider once again. Open up the tag section. And there we go. There's enemy. Do the same thing for the drum. There we go. Now, if you go back into your scene, you will notice that each one of these has been updated. So the enemy collider now has a tag of enemy. Same thing for all of these in here. That's why it's important to use prefabs and to go into the prefabs themselves if you do want to make changes across the board. All right, so all of our enemies have now been tagged as enemy, so we can actually hit play and see how this works. All right, so you'll notice that our cursor has now disappeared. It has been locked to the center of our screen, so we just see the crosshair now. And if we hover over the enemies, you can see it turns red. If I hover away, you can see it turns white. Same thing for the drum. And this should apply to all of our enemy characters. Now I want to go over the else statement within that script once again. Now what I mean by that is that if we were to look at our enemy character like this, and are to move up directly, there's no collider in the air here to have it change back to white, and that's why we use that else statement. So if I go back into that script, we're going to go back into the UI script, and I'm going to comment this out. So I'm just going to add in some double lines, save this, and try this once again. So I'm looking at the character, but if I move away into the air, you can see it stays red. And that's why we have that else statement. So if I look at the wall, there is a collider there, so it's actually going to turn white. But if we're looking at something that doesn't have a collider, then it doesn't know when to switch back. Let's go back into the script itself. Let's uncomment that out again. There we go. I'm going to save that, minimize, and give this one more try. And this should apply to all of the characters in here. So this one over here should turn red. I can look down my iron sights, let go, and it still turns red. Look away, it turns white. so on and so forth. So that is how you add a crosshair that changes colors when we're looking at our enemy character, and that is how you hide the cursor when we're looking down the iron sights.